In this third lecture on national measures of welfare and prosperity, we're going to discuss the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. In the last lecture, we discussed the Human Development Index, which is used by the United Nations Development Program. The objective of the HDI is to ensure that development decisions are not only focused on economic advances, but also on improvements in human well-being. However, we also mentioned that the HDI has limitations because there are many more social aspects that could be considered, and the health of the environment is not considered at all. In this lecture, we will discuss the Genuine Progress Indicator, which represents yet another set of values and priorities. The objective of the Genuine Progress Indicator is to provide a much more comprehensive picture of a nation's welfare by looking not only at the economic indicators, but also integrating a wide range of environmental aspects. The GPI is therefore grounded in the three pillars of sustainability, which include environmental, social, and economic aspects, as illustrated by the Venn diagram at the right. We will be looking at these components in greater detail in the course when we start talking about sustainability. In addition to looking at the pillars of sustainability, the GPI also explicitly distinguished the factors that contribute to human well-being from the factors that detract from human well-being. So the GDP that we talked about previously consists of four indicators, focusing on spending, consumption, investment, government spending, and net export. And the Human Development Index that we talked about previously uses four indicators covering health, schooling, and standard of living. The Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, uses a whopping 26 indicators covering the three domains of sustainability. So now let's take a look at the Genuine Progress Indicator in a little bit more detail. The GPI can be visualized as a massive balance sheet with three columns and two rows. The columns represent the three pillars of sustainability, and the top row is for factors that contribute to human welfare, whereas the bottom row is for factors that detract from human welfare. This creates a grid with 6 different bins that we can use for organizing the 26 indicators of the GPI. Let's fill in this grid, and let's start with the top left corner because it includes some of the economic indicators that we are most familiar with already. So to capture economic factors that contribute to the welfare of a nation's GPI, we've got personal consumption, the benefits from consumer durables, and net capital investments. The consumption and investment terms we know already from the GDP. The benefits from consumer durables relates to the benefits that we get from equipment like cars, washing machines, stoves, or fridges that require a big investment up front, but then contribute to our welfare for many years. Let's stay in the economic indicator column and look at the factors that detract from national welfare. In this bin, we have the purchase of these consumer durables, underemployment, and the net foreign borrowing. The first term captures the investment into the cars, washing machines, and so on that are necessary before we can benefit from them. Unemployment is generally not a good thing for an economy, and people who are unable to find work or sufficient work often suffer both economically and mentally. The GPI, therefore, considers the costs associated with underemployment as a detractor from national welfare. This does not mean that people who are unemployed should not be supported, but rather that ideally we would not have any unemployment. Net foreign borrowing is in this bin because it is not good when you have to borrow money to support your consumption habits. Let's move over to the column with social indicators. In the top row, we have all the unpaid or non-market contributions to national welfare that we highlighted as missing during our discussion of the GDP. This includes housework, parenting, and volunteer work. The bin also includes the value of higher education, which was considered in the Human Development Index, and the value of the use of highways and streets, which is kind of similar to the value of consumer durables. Indicators that describe social components that detract from a nation's welfare are the cost of crime, household pollution abatement, which are personal efforts to reduce the effect of pollution, like water filters, the loss of leisure time, the cost of commuting, and car accidents. Some of these indicators are self-explanatory and don't need additional explanations. Just a quick comment, though, about the loss of leisure time and commuting. If you have to work longer hours and commute further to make the same amount of money, these extra efforts detract from your quality of life and should be accounted for. So these are all the social welfare indicators that the GPI considers. So let's move to the last column that includes environmental indicators. Perhaps not surprisingly, there are no indicators in the top row because the vast majority of our actions currently do not improve the environment in a way that can contribute to our long-term human welfare. But in the bottom row, there are a bunch of indicators. This is where we have the costs of water, air, and noise pollution, the cost of the loss of primary forests and the damage from logging roads, the loss of wetlands and farmlands. Other indicators are the costs of damage caused by CO2 emissions, the depletion of stratospheric ozone layer, and simply the depletion of non-renewable resources. All of these indicators try to capture the environmental effects of the consumption activities that contribute to our welfare and prosperity. Now, if you look carefully, you can see dollar figures at the end of each of the labels. These figures were published by researchers who used the Genuine Progress Indicator to estimate the welfare and prosperity of the US in 2007. So each of these dollar figures provides an indication of the size of either the contribution or detraction to welfare. So when you look at the top row, personal consumption is the biggest contributor, but household work and parenting also contribute a substantial amount. On the detractor side, the depletion of non-renewable resources, the damage from CO2 emissions, and the purchase of consumer durables are some of the biggest factors that detract from human welfare. This clearly highlights that our welfare and prosperity are built by depleting the environment. Now, if we take a step back again and look at the bigger picture, you can group all the indicators into three main categories. In the top row, we have the value of human activities that contribute to human welfare. This is how our own activities and actions improve human welfare. The bottom row is split up into the economic and societal costs associated with these human activities that usually detract from creating human welfare. And the cost of the long-term destruction of our natural capital is in the bottom right corner. So you can see that the GPI is a much more comprehensive perspective on welfare and prosperity than the GDP or the HDI are. Now, in 2004, the GDP, the gross domestic product in the US, was roughly 10 trillion with a T dollars, while the GPI was only $4,000 billion or $4 trillion. This now explicitly shows that there's a substantial social and environmental cost associated with our spending. In our lecture on the GDP, we made the comparison with personal finances, where we highlighted that the GDP perspective would only consider our spending. In comparison, the approach of the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, also looks at the cost side associated with our spending and any withdrawals we make from our savings account. This clearly provides a more meaningful perspective on our financial well-being. Similarly, the GPI provides a much more comprehensive picture of the overall welfare of a nation. Now, this is very interesting and insightful so far, but it's necessary to remember that coming up with these numbers in a meaningful way requires serious assumptions and a sophisticated accounting system. So unfortunately, it's not feasible to create an annual GPI statistic for every country around the world. Nevertheless, once you have these numbers for a country, you can conduct some very interesting analyses. In this chart, you see the development of both the per capita GDP and GPI in the US from 1950 to 2004. Now, there are two distinct periods in this chart. Before about 1978, these two lines were both going up more or less in parallel. This means that both the GDP and the GPI were growing during that time. But after 1978, the two lines split, with the GPI roughly staying the same levels as it was before 1978, while the GDP continued to increase. So what does this all mean? It essentially means that since the 1980s, the additional benefit we get from personal spending is completely offset by the costs associated with undesirable social consequences of the spending and the destruction of the environment. So all of that additional spending and welfare that is recognized by the GDP, all that additional spending is on credit, which means people are borrowing from other banks and borrowing natural capital from other species and future generations. Now, the separation of the GDP and the GPI has not only been observed in the US, but in many other countries, as shown on these charts, where you have the development of the GDP on the left and the GPI on the right. Some economists have proposed a thresholds theory, and this theory says that every society initially goes through a period in which economic growth brings an improvement in the quality of life, but this only works up to a certain point, the threshold point that we're calling it, after which more economic growth actually leads to a decrease in the quality of life due to social and environmental costs. Let's take a look and highlight some other neat analyses that one can do with the numbers provided by the GPI. What you see on this chart is the progression of the contribution terms included in the GPI from 1950 to 2004. So all of the indicators in the top row of our balance sheet that we talked about a few slides back are shown here. For this analysis, these indicators have been grouped into three classes: personal consumption, non-market time, and capital services. On the left, you can see how the individual indicators are split up into different categories. Now, the interesting thing is that the proportion of the non-market time, so all of the unpaid work and contributions to welfare, has decreased from 41 to 32%. This means that these types of contributions are losing importance. A good example of this is childcare. Childcare is getting increasingly outsourced by parents to nannies and daycares. But to be able to afford this, parents need to work more so that they can bring in the necessary money to pay for the childcare. Now, while the decision between working and parenting is a very personal one and influenced by many, many factors, it seems important to reflect on which of these pathways is actually producing higher welfare at the societal level. Now, we can do a similar analysis with the indicators in the bottom row of the balance sheet to get some insight on how the detracting factors have evolved over time. This chart shows the cost associated with the depletion of natural capital. The light green band has increased dramatically from about 35% in 1950 to 59% in 2004. This means that our welfare is relying more and more on the destruction of the natural environment. And based on some of the previous discussions we've had about the Earth system, this is not a very good trend. Let's summarize the main points of the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. The GPI is the most comprehensive economic perspective on national welfare. So instead of just looking at spending, like the GDP, it also looks at the economic and societal costs associated with that spending and how much we are withdrawing from our environmental savings accounts. So it looks at both contributions and detractors of welfare and organizes them around the three pillars of sustainability. Now, I don't expect you to memorize all the different indicators of the GPI, but I do want you to understand the philosophy and the big picture ideas and concepts behind the approach. Of course, there are limitations to this approach as well. First, it requires a detailed accounting system, which is not easy to implement, and everything needs to be expressed in dollar values, which is also not an easy task. In fact, there's an entire field in environmental economics called non-market valuation that tries to figure out how to describe the value of goods and services that are not exchanged in traditional marketplaces. But that's something else for another course. So we have looked at the gross domestic product, the GDP, the Human Development Index, the HDI, and in this lecture, the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. the last measure of national welfare we're going to examine is the measure of gross national happiness. So thank you for listening to this, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.